A little girl secretly gave a rescue signal at the park, and a soldier saw it, then followed. He thought it was just another quiet afternoon. But when a frightened child started tapping her shoe in a pattern only a trained soldier would recognize, everything changed. With one glance, he knew. This wasn't a game. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He followed quietly, heart pounding, as the man beside her grew more controlling, more dangerous. And what he uncovered would tear open a chain of events no one saw coming. One that would test his courage, his faith, and his broken heart. Because saving her might be the one thing that saves him, too. Brief pause. Emotional swell of music. But who was that little girl really trying to reach that day? And what happens when a single act of courage brings two lost souls together and changes both their lives forever? The late afternoon sun poured through the canopy of oak trees, painting everything in warm gold. Dan Cole sat on his usual bench, third one from the left, facing the playground, watching Scout nose at a tennis ball that had rolled beneath the seat. The old golden retriever's muzzle had gone gray, but his eyes still held that gentle spark of understanding. Dan picked up the ball and lobbed it a few feet forward. Scout trotted after it with dignified patience, the kind that came with age and service. The dog had been with him through everything, through the nightmares, through the empty house, through mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible. "Good boy," Dan said quietly as Scout dropped the ball at his feet. Around him, the park hummed with life. Children shrieked with laughter on the swings. A group of teenagers passed a soccer ball back and forth near the pavilion. Parents chatted on blankets spread across the grass, their voices blending into a comfortable murmur. Dan watched it all from a distance, the way he always did, close enough to see, far enough not to intrude. A red kite suddenly dipped low, tangling in the branches of a nearby maple. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, stood beneath it, his face crumpling with disappointment. Dan rose from the bench. "Need a hand?" The boy nodded, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Dan reached up and gently worked the kite free from the branches, careful not to tear the thin fabric. He handed it back with a small smile. "There you go. Keep it higher next time." "Thanks, mister." The boy ran off, clutching the kite string. Dan returned to his bench. Scout had settled at his feet, resting his chin on his paws. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the grass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bag of dog treats. Scout's ears perked immediately. "Don't get too excited," Dan said, holding one out. "Doctor says you're supposed to watch your weight." Scout took the treat delicately, his tail thumping twice against the ground. Dan scratched behind the dog's ears, his fingers finding that spot Scout loved. "What do you think, buddy? Should we grab Chinese on the way home? Or are we doing leftover chicken again?" Scout tilted his head, as if considering the question seriously. "Yeah, me neither." Dan sighed. "Chinese it is." The park was emptying now. Parents gathered children and folded up blankets. The teenagers packed up their soccer ball. The laughter grew quieter, softer, until it was just the breeze rustling the leaves. Dan stayed. He always stayed until the light turned that particular shade of orange, the color it had been that last afternoon before deployment, before everything changed, before she was gone. He closed his eyes and could almost see her, sitting right here beside him, her hand in his, laughing at something silly he'd said. They'd spent hours on this bench, planning their future, talking about kids they'd never had, a home they'd never finished building. His hand moved unconsciously to the chain around his neck. His fingers found the wedding band hanging there, smooth, warm from his skin. He'd worn it every day since the funeral, couldn't bring himself to put it in a drawer, couldn't let it go. Scout shifted, resting his head on Dan's knee. The dog always knew, always sensed when the silence grew too heavy. "I miss her, Scout." Dan's voice was barely a whisper. Every single day. The sky deepened to amber and rose. A lone jogger passed by, earbuds in, lost in her own world. The playground stood empty now, the swings swaying slightly in the breeze. Dan sat there, one hand on Scout's head, the other clutching the wedding band. The park had given him something these past few years, not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace. A place where he could remember without drowning. A place where life continued around him, reminding him that the world kept turning even when his had stopped. Scout stood and stretched, his joints creaking slightly. He looked up at Dan with patient eyes. Dan nodded. Yeah, I know. He gathered the leash and rose slowly from the bench. His knees protested, a gift from too many years carrying heavy packs through rough terrain. Scout waited beside him, steady and calm. Dan took one last look at the empty playground, at the oak trees now silhouetted against the darkening sky. Let's go home, buddy. They walked down the familiar path together, two old soldiers heading back to a quiet house. Scout's tags jingled softly with each step. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Tomorrow, Dan would return. Same bench, same time, same routine that held his life together like stitches on a wound. The next morning arrived crisp and clear. Dan walked through the park gates just after 10, a paper cup of black coffee warming his palm. Scout ambled beside him, taking his time to sniff at a clump of dandelions sprouting near the entrance. The park was busier than usual. A group of mothers had claimed the picnic tables near the playground, their strollers lined up like a small fleet. Children darted between the jungle gym and the slides, their voices bright with energy. A young couple tossed a frisbee on the open grass, their dog bounding between them. Spring had truly arrived. The air carried the scent of fresh blooms and warm earth. The trees had filled out completely now, their leaves a vibrant green that rustled in the gentle breeze. Dan made his way to his bench, the third from the left, and settled in with a satisfied exhale. Scout circled twice before lying down in the shade beneath the seat. Dan took a long sip of coffee and unfolded the newspaper he'd picked up at the corner store. The front page was the usual mix of local politics and community events. He scanned the headlines without much interest, then turned to the sports section. The Braves were on a winning streak. He smiled faintly, remembering how his wife used to tease him about caring more about baseball than football. Scout let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping once against the ground. Dan glanced down. Comfortable. The dog's eyes were already half closed. Thought so. Dan returned to his paper, sipping his coffee slowly. Around him, the park continued its cheerful chaos. A little boy chased bubbles blown by his grandmother. Two girls took turns pushing each other on the swings. A father helped his toddler navigate the wobbly bridge on the playground. It was the kind of scene Dan usually let wash over him, pleasant background noise to his quiet routine. But something shifted. A stillness caught his attention, a wrong note in the symphony. He lowered his paper slightly and scanned the park. His eyes landed on a bench about 30 yards away, partially obscured by a maple tree. A man sat there, mid-30s, wearing jeans and a navy jacket despite the warmth. His posture was rigid, uncomfortable. Next to him sat a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair pulled into two neat braids. She wore a pink dress and white sneakers, but she wasn't playing, wasn't smiling, wasn't doing anything a child usually did at a park on a beautiful spring morning. She sat perfectly still, hands clasped tight in her lap, shoulders hunched forward. Her eyes darted from left to right, never settling on anything for long. Dan's instincts hummed quietly, the same instincts that had kept him alive in hostile territory. He lifted his paper again, pretending to read while watching over the top of the page. The man leaned toward the girl and said something. She nodded quickly, her movements jerky, nervous. Then Dan heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, 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 tap. Another pause. Tap, tap, tap. His blood went cold. The girl's hand was resting against her knee, her fingers tapping in a deliberate rhythm, not fidgeting, not random, purposeful. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Dan's hands tightened on the newspaper, crinkling the edges. The girl's eyes lifted, just for a second, and met his across the distance. Her lips trembled. Fear radiated from her small frame like heat. Then she looked at him again, intentionally, directly. Her fingers tapped once more. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, tap, tap. Dan's heart slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry. He'd learned Morse code during basic training, used it in the field when radio silence was critical. He knew that rhythm, as well as he knew his own heartbeat. That little girl wasn't just scared. She was sending a distress signal. Scout lifted his head, sensing the sudden tension radiating from Dan. The dog's ears pricked forward, alert. Dan slowly lowered the newspaper onto the bench beside him. His coffee sat forgotten, growing cold in his hand. Every muscle in his body had gone taut, ready. He watched as the man stood abruptly, gripping the girl's arm. She rose quickly, too quickly, and kept her eyes down as he led her toward the parking lot. Dan whispered, barely audible, "Something's wrong." Scout stood immediately, his training kicking in. Dan's mind raced through possibilities, through protocols, through every instinct honed over years of service. This wasn't a coincidence. That signal wasn't a game. That little girl needed help. And this time, for the first time in years, Dan didn't hesitate. He rose from the bench and followed. Dan rose from the bench slowly, his movements deliberate. The newspaper slipped from his lap and fluttered to the ground. He didn't reach for it. Scout stood immediately, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The man and the girl were already 30 feet ahead, moving toward the parking lot exit. Dan followed, keeping a lamppost between himself and them. His body moved automatically, falling into patterns he'd learned years ago. Stay low, stay quiet, use cover. They turned left onto Maple Street. Dan crossed to the opposite sidewalk, positioning himself behind a row of parked cars. Scout trotted beside him without a sound, matching his pace perfectly. The man walked quickly, his hand wrapped tight around Lila's wrist. She stumbled once, trying to keep up with his longer strides. He didn't slow down. Dan's jaw clenched. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed 911, pressing it to his ear while maintaining visual contact. 911, what's your emergency? I'm following a man with a child, Dan said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Little girl, maybe 8 years old. She signaled for help. Something's not right. Where are you located, sir? Maple Street, heading west from Brookdale Park. They just passed Henderson Avenue. Can you describe the man? Mid-30s, navy jacket, jeans, dark hair. The girl's wearing a pink dress, white sneakers. And what makes you think she needs help? She gave me an SOS signal. Morse code. Tapped it out deliberately. I'm former Army. I know what I saw. The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Stay on the line, sir. I'm dispatching units now. Do not engage. Keep your distance and maintain visual contact. Understood. Dan kept moving, crossing another intersection as they did. A minivan passed between them, providing momentary cover. The man glanced over his shoulder once, scanning the street behind him, but Dan had already ducked behind a mailbox. Scout stayed pressed against his leg, perfectly trained. They continued for another block. The man's pace quickened. Leela was nearly jogging now, her braids bouncing with each step. She looked back once, just once, and her eyes found Dan's across the distance. He gave her the smallest nod. Keep going. I'm here. The dispatcher's voice crackled in his ear. Units are 2 minutes out. What's your current location? Corner of Maple and 4th. They're heading toward... Dan paused, watching them turn into a gas station. They just entered the Shell station on the corner. Stay outside the building if possible. Do not approach. Copy. Dan crossed the street and positioned himself near a vending machine at the edge of the station lot. From here, he had a clear view of the pumps and the small convenience store. The man bypassed the pumps entirely and headed straight for a dark sedan parked near the air pump. A blue Honda Civic, maybe 10 years old. Dan memorized the license plate immediately. KJT 4729. The man pulled keys from his pocket and unlocked the driver's door. Lila stood frozen beside the car, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "Get in," the man said, loud enough for Dan to hear across the lot. Lila didn't move. "I said get in!" His voice turned sharp. She shook her head once. Small. Defiant. The man grabbed her arm and yanked hard. Lila stumbled forward, her shoulder slamming against the car door. Dan's body moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the lot in long strides, Scout at his heels. "Hey!" The man's head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise. Dan stopped 10 feet away, hands visible, voice calm but firm. "Let her go!" "Mind your business," the man snarled, tightening his grip on Lila's arm. "Can't do that." Dan took another step forward. "Police are on their way." The man's face twisted with fury. "She's my daughter." "No, she's not." Lila looked up at Dan, tears streaming down her face. The distant wail of sirens cut through the air, growing louder, closer. The man cursed and released Lila's arm, stumbling backward toward the car. "Don't," Dan said quietly, his voice like steel. 2 police cruisers screamed into the lot, lights flashing red and blue. Officers poured out, guns drawn. "Hands up! Step away from the vehicle!" The man froze, then slowly raised his hands. An officer rushed forward and tackled him to the pavement, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Another officer, a woman with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, knelt beside Lila. "You're safe now, sweetheart." "You're safe." Lila collapsed into her arms, sobbing. Dan stood frozen, his hands still trembling at his sides. His heart hammered in his chest. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind something raw and unfamiliar. He'd just saved a child's life. Scout sat beside him, perfectly still, tail resting against the pavement. The dog's eyes locked onto Dan's face, steady and knowing. Something inside Dan, something that had been locked away for years, cracked open. The police station smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. Dan sat in a small interview room, his hands folded on the scratched table in front of him. A detective, middle-aged, kind eyes, sat across from him, taking notes as Dan walked through everything that had happened. "And you recognized the signal immediately?" the detective asked. "Yes, ma'am. Army training. Field medics learn Morse code for emergencies. Lucky for that little girl you did." Dan didn't respond. Luck felt like the wrong word. The detective asked a few more questions. Times, locations, descriptions. Dan answered each one calmly, factually. He left out the trembling in his hands when he'd crossed that parking lot. Left out the way his heart had nearly stopped when the man grabbed Lila's arm. "You did good work today, Mr. Cole." The detective closed her notebook. "Real good work." Before Dan could respond, the door burst open. A woman rushed in, her eyes red and swollen, her hair disheveled. She was young, early 30s maybe, wearing scrubs like she'd come straight from work. Behind her, barely visible, was Lila. The woman, Rachel, stopped short when she saw Dan. Her hand flew to her mouth. "You," her voice broke. "You're the one who saved her." Dan stood awkwardly. Thank you." Rachel crossed the room in 3 quick steps and grabbed his hands. Tears streamed down her face. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." "Ma'am, She could have been gone. I could have lost her." Rachel's voice cracked completely. I can't." She couldn't finish. She just stood there, holding Dan's hands, crying. Dan felt his throat tighten. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do with this kind of gratitude. Behind Rachel, Lila peeked out, her small face still pale. When she saw Dan, she gave him the tiniest wave. He nodded back gently. The detective stood and placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "Mrs. Moore, why don't you have a seat? I need to explain what's going to happen next." Rachel released Dan's hands and sank into the chair beside him, pulling Lila onto her lap. The little girl buried her face in her mother's shoulder. "The suspect we arrested is Marcus Hale," the detective said. "He's been wanted in 3 states for attempted kidnapping and assault. He's been on the run for 6 weeks. She looked at Dan. "Your quick thinking prevented a tragedy today, Mr. Cole. No question about it." Rachel's arms tightened around Lila. "We'll need Lila to speak with a child psychologist tomorrow," the detective continued. "Standard procedure. And we'll keep you updated on the case." Rachel nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. They finished the paperwork. Rachel thanked Dan 3 more times before they left the station. Each time, Dan told her it wasn't necessary. Each time, she insisted it was. The next morning, Dan was in his kitchen making coffee when someone knocked on his door. Scout's tail thumped against the floor, but he didn't bark. Dan opened the door and found Rachel standing on his porch, a plastic container in her hands. Lila stood beside her, holding her mother's hand. I hope I'm not bothering you," Rachel said quickly. "I got your address from the police report. I know that's probably weird, but She held out the container. "I made you cookies, chocolate chip. It's not enough, I know, but I needed to thank you again." Dan took the container. "You didn't have to do this." "I did, though." Rachel's smile was tired but genuine. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" Dan stepped aside and let them in. Scout greeted Lila with a gentle nuzzle, and she giggled, the first real sound of joy Dan had heard from her. They sat in the living room, Rachel perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm a single mom," she said quietly. "Lost my job 3 weeks ago. Budget cuts at the hospital. I've been working double shifts at a diner ever since, trying to keep up with rent." She glanced at Lila, who was sitting on the floor beside Scout. "That day at the park, I only left her for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I had to run to the pharmacy across the street because she needed her inhaler refilled, and I couldn't afford to miss another shift." "You don't have to explain," Dan said. "I do." Rachel's voice trembled. "Because the Child Welfare Agency doesn't see it that way." Dan frowned. "What do you mean?" "They reopened my custody file. Because of the kidnapping." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "They think I was careless, neglectful. They're investigating whether Lila should stay with me." Dan felt something cold settle in his chest. "I'm a good mom," Rachel whispered. "I swear I am. I'm doing this alone, and I'm so tired. And I thought 10 minutes wouldn't matter." Lila looked up at her mother, worry written across her small face. Rachel wiped her eyes quickly and forced a smile. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be dumping this on you. You already did so much." "No." Dan's voice was firm. "Don't apologize." Rachel stood, pulling Lila to her feet. "We should go. Thank you again. For everything." They walked to the door. Rachel paused on the porch, her hand resting on Lila's shoulder. "They think I was careless," she whispered again, almost to herself. Dan felt that protective instinct rise up inside him, the same instinct that had sent him across that parking lot yesterday. "You won't face this alone," he said quietly. Rachel looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face. "I mean it," Dan said. "Whatever you need. I'll help." Rachel's eyes welled up again, but this time she smiled through the tears. "Thank you." She and Lila walked down the porch steps and toward their car. Dan watched them go, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Scout appeared at his side, standing in the doorway. The dog's tail thumped once against the door frame. Slow, deliberate, like a promise being sealed. A week later, Rachel's car wouldn't start. Dan stood in her apartment building's parking lot, hood propped open, checking the battery terminals. Rachel paced behind him, her interview folder clutched to her chest. "I can't miss this," she said. "It's at the medical center. Full-time position. Benefits. You won't miss it." Dan straightened and wiped his hands on a rag. "Battery's dead. Won't fix in time. I'll drive you." Rachel's shoulders sagged with relief. "Are you sure?" "Wouldn't offer if I wasn't." 20 minutes later, they were on the highway. Lila sat in the back seat beside Scout, her small hand resting on his fur. The dog's tail thumped lazily against the seat. "You really don't have to do this," Rachel said. "Already doing it." Dan kept his eyes on the road. Rachel smiled faintly and smoothed her dress. "I'm nervous. Haven't interviewed in years." "You'll do fine." "How do you know?" "Because you fight for what matters." Dan glanced at her briefly. "They'll see that." Rachel's expression softened. She looked out the window for a moment, then back at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why are you helping us?" Dan was quiet for a few seconds. His hands tightened on the wheel. "Because I can," he said simply. Rachel studied his face, searching for something deeper, but she didn't push. "I wanted to be a nurse once," she said quietly. "Got 2 years into school before Lila came along. Her father left a month after she was born. Said he wasn't ready." Her voice didn't hold bitterness, just exhaustion. "I dropped out to work full-time. Haven't gone back since." "You could still finish," Dan said. Rachel laughed softly. "Maybe someday, when things settle." In the back seat, Lila hummed a tune Dan didn't recognize. Scout's ears perked up, listening. They arrived at the medical center with 10 minutes to spare. Rachel grabbed her folder and turned to Dan. "Thank you. Again. Good luck." She smiled nervously and hurried inside. Dan pulled the truck into a parking spot and waited. Lila climbed into the front seat, settling beside him. "She's gonna get the job," Lila said confidently. "Yeah?" "Yeah. Mom's really smart. And brave." Dan nodded. "I believe you." They sat in comfortable silence. Scout poked his head between the seats, resting his chin on Lila's shoulder. An hour later, Rachel came back out, her face unreadable. Dan's stomach tightened. Then she grinned. "Second interview next week," she said breathlessly. "They said I'm a strong candidate." Lila squealed and threw her arms around her mother. Dan exhaled, relief washing through him. That afternoon, Dan returned to Rachel's apartment with tools from his garage. He spent 2 hours replacing her car battery and checking the alternator. Rachel offered to pay him, but he refused. "Already told you," Dan said. "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" Dan paused, grease-stained rag in hand. He looked at Lila, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Just glad I could help." Lila crossed her arms. "That's not fair. You gotta get something." "Lila, I'll teach Scout a trick," she announced. "That'll be your payment." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You're gonna teach my dog a trick?" "Yep." Rachel laughed. "Good luck with that, sweetheart." But Lila was already kneeling beside Scout, whispering to him like they were sharing secrets. Dan watched, amused, as she held up her hand and said firmly, "High five." Scout stared at her. "High five," she repeated, tapping her palm. Scout lifted his paw slowly and placed it against her hand. Lila beamed. "See? He's smart." Dan chuckled. "Guess he is." Days passed like that. Easy, natural. Dan stopped by occasionally, bringing groceries when he noticed their fridge running low. He fixed a leaky faucet in their bathroom, replaced a broken lock on the front door. Lila began smiling more. She drew pictures for him, stick figures of her, her mom, Dan, and Scout standing under a big tree. She taped them to his refrigerator when he wasn't looking. Rachel cooked dinner for him one evening as thanks. Nothing fancy, spaghetti and garlic bread. But it tasted better than anything Dan had eaten in years. "This is really good," he said. "It's just pasta." "Still good." Rachel smiled. her cheeks flushing slightly. "Well, you're welcome here any time." Dan nodded, his chest warm. That night, after dinner, Rachel stood at the sink washing dishes. Dan dried them beside her, handing each plate to Lila, who stacked them carefully on the counter. "Thank you," Rachel said softly, "for everything. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to." "I do, though." She glanced at him. "You've done so much for us." Dan set down the towel. "You'd do the same if it were me." Rachel's eyes glistened. "Yeah, I would." At the table, Lila sat with crayons spread across the surface, drawing intently. Her tongue poked out in concentration as she colored a picture of Scout chasing butterflies through a field of flowers. Dan watched her for a moment, then looked around the small kitchen. The walls were faded, the appliances old, but warmth filled the space. Laughter. Life. Scout rested at their feet, his head on his paws, eyes half closed. Outside the window, the city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. Dan felt something loosen inside him, something that had been tight and guarded for years. Peace. Fragile. Uncertain. But real. Morning sunlight poured through Dan's kitchen window, warm and golden. He stood at the counter, measuring out Scout's food into the metal bowl. The dog sat patiently, tail sweeping the floor. "Good boy," Dan murmured, setting the bowl down. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. Dan frowned and answered. "Hello? Mr. Cole? This is Helen Briggs from Channel 7 News. I'm doing a story about the park rescue last week. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" Dan's jaw tightened. "I don't know. Just 5 minutes," she pressed. "People are calling you a hero. Your story could inspire others to stay vigilant, help keep kids safe." Dan hesitated. He didn't want attention. But if it helped other children stay safe... "All right," he said. 5 minutes. The interview happened in his living room that afternoon. A cameraman set up lights while Helen Briggs, young and eager, sat across from Dan with a notepad. "Tell me what you saw that day," she began. Dan kept his answers short, factual. He described the signal, the chase, the arrest. He refused to give Rachel or Lila's names. "They deserve privacy," he said firmly. Helen smiled. "Of course. You're very thoughtful." The segment aired that evening. Dan watched from his couch, Scout beside him. The reporter called him a humble hero, showed footage of the park, interviewed a police officer who praised his quick thinking. It seemed fine. Dan turned off the TV and went to bed, relieved it was over. By morning, everything had changed. Dan's phone rang before sunrise. Rachel's number. "Hello?" Silence, then a choked breath. "Rachel? Have you seen the news?" Her voice shook. "What?" "I watched it last night. Not the segment. The headlines." Dan's stomach dropped. He grabbed his laptop and opened a news website. The first headline made his blood run cold. "Veteran rescues girl as neglectful mother fails to notice kidnapping." Another read, "Where was mom? Hero veteran steps in when parent doesn't." A third, "Single mother under investigation after child saved by stranger." "Rachel, they're saying I wasn't watching her." Her voice cracked. "That I didn't care. That's not what I said. I never. It doesn't matter what you said." She was crying now. "Everyone thinks it anyway. My neighbors won't look at me. Someone left a note on my door calling me unfit." Dan's chest tightened. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this." "The welfare office called," she whispered. "They want a follow-up review. They're coming to my apartment tomorrow." Dan stood, pacing. "I'll tell them the truth. I'll explain." "Explain what? That you followed us because I lost track of my daughter for 2 minutes? That's exactly what they think happened. That's not... Rachel, she was taken from the playground while you were at work. You weren't even there. Try telling that to everyone reading those headlines." The line went quiet, except for her ragged breathing. "I have to go," she said finally. "Wait." The call ended. Dan spent the rest of the day calling the news station, demanding corrections. A bored intern told him the headlines came from online editors, not the reporter. Nothing they could do. He tried calling Rachel back. No answer. By evening, he couldn't sit still. He grabbed his keys and drove to her apartment. Rachel opened the door before he could knock. Her eyes were red and swollen. Leela stood behind her, clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Rachel, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Her voice was flat, exhausted. "That you made me look like a bad mother? I never said that. I told them you deserved privacy. I didn't give your name. But you told them the story." Her voice rose. "You talked about the rescue, about how you had to step in. And now everyone thinks I wasn't paying attention, that I'm careless, neglectful. That's not true." "It doesn't matter if it's true." Tears streamed down her face. "It's what they believe. It's what the welfare office will believe when they come tomorrow." Dan stepped forward, desperate. "I'll go with you. I'll tell them exactly what happened." "No." Rachel's hands trembled. "You've done enough." "Rachel." "I trusted you," she whispered. "I let you into our lives. And now, everything's falling apart." Dan's throat tightened. "I was trying to help." "I know." Her voice broke. "But you didn't. You made it worse." She stepped back, pulling Lila with her. "Please don't come back," Rachel said quietly. The door closed. Dan stood frozen in the hallway. Scout whined softly beside him, pressing against his leg. Inside the apartment, he heard Lila crying, heard Rachel's soft, soothing voice trying to comfort her. Dan turned and walked away, his chest hollow. The fragile trust between them had shattered, and he didn't know how to fix it. 3 days passed like years. Dan's house felt colder now. The sunlight through the windows seemed dimmer. The silence pressed against his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. Scout lay near the couch, watching his master with worried eyes. The dog hadn't eaten much, hadn't played. He sensed Dan's grief the way he always did. The newspaper sat crumpled on the floor where Dan had thrown it, the headline still visible through the creases, a reminder of how everything had fallen apart. Dan reached for his phone, stared at Rachel's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. He pressed it. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. He hung up without leaving a message. What could he say that he hadn't already tried to explain? Scout whined softly. "I know, buddy," Dan murmured. "I know." He spent the afternoon trying to write a letter, sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, searching for the right words. "Dear Rachel, I'm sorry for—" He crossed it out. "Rachel, please understand that I never meant—" He crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. How could he make her understand? The news had twisted everything, turned his attempt to help into something that hurt her. He tried again, and again. Each attempt ended in the trash. Finally, he gave up. Late afternoon, Dan found himself at Brookdale Park. Scout walked beside him, leash loose in Dan's hand. The park looked the same. Children played on the swings. Parents chatted on benches. A breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, but it felt different now. Dan walked to the bench where he'd first seen Lila, where he'd recognized the signal that changed everything. He sat down heavily. Scout settled at his feet. A little girl ran past, laughing. Her mother called after her, smiling. Dan's chest tightened. He thought about Lila's trembling hands tapping that desperate message. Thought about Rachel's tears when she'd thanked him that first night. Thought about the warmth in her kitchen, the way Lila had drawn pictures while Scout dozed nearby. For a brief, fragile moment, his house had felt like a home again. Now it was just empty walls and silence. Dan closed his eyes. The ache in his chest spread until it felt like drowning. "I tried," he whispered to no one. "I tried to help." Scout lifted his head and pressed against Dan's leg. They sat there until the sun began to set, until the families packed up and went home, until the park grew quiet and still. Dan stood finally, joints stiff. "Come on, boy, let's go." The house was dark when they returned. Dan didn't bother turning on lights. He fed Scout, though the dog barely touched his food. Then Dan stood in the kitchen, staring at the container of cookies Rachel had baked. They sat on the counter, untouched. He'd meant to eat them, kept putting it off. Now they seemed like relics from another life. He picked up the container, opened it. The cookies were still soft, still smelled faintly of vanilla and cinnamon. Rachel had made these to thank him, had stood in her small kitchen, mixing and baking, wanting to show gratitude, and he'd repaid her by making everything worse. Dan set the container down, vision blurring. He realized something then, standing in that dark kitchen. Rachel and Lila had brought light back into his life. Real light, the kind that warmed from the inside. Without them, the house felt like a tomb again. Scout padded over and rested his head on Dan's knee. The dog's eyes were soft, understanding. Dan reached down and scratched behind Scout's ears. "What do I do, buddy?" Scout's tail thumped once against the floor. Dan almost smiled. Almost. That night, he stepped onto the porch for air. The street was quiet. Streetlights glowed orange against the darkness. He noticed the mailbox flag was down. Strange. He'd already checked the mail that morning. Dan walked down the steps and opened the mailbox. Inside was a single envelope. No stamp. No address. Hand-delivered. His heart began to pound. He carried it inside and turned on the kitchen light. Scout watched from the doorway. Dan opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a child's drawing, crayon and marker on white paper, a soldier sitting under a tree, a golden dog beside him, and a little girl with dark hair, her hand raised, tapping her shoe. The colors were bright, cheerful, but something about the girl's eyes made Dan's throat tighten. Beneath the drawing, in careful, wobbly handwriting, "You saved me once. Don't stop now." Dan gripped the picture with both hands, his vision blurred. Tears spilled down his cheeks before he could stop them. Lila had drawn this, had snuck it into his mailbox somehow. She still believed in him, even when her mother couldn't, even when the world had turned against them both. This little girl still had faith. Dan sank into a chair, holding the drawing like a lifeline. Scout padded over and pressed against his leg. "All right, kiddo," Dan whispered, voice breaking. "I won't." He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't give up. Not on Rachel. Not on Lila. Not on the fragile family he'd found and almost lost. Whatever it took, he would make this right. The next morning, Dan stood in front of his bathroom mirror. His hand shook slightly as he ran the razor across his jaw. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, hadn't cared much about his appearance lately. But today was different. Today he needed to look like someone worth believing in. He rinsed his face and toweled it dry. Then he pulled on his cleanest shirt, a simple blue button-down Rachel had once complimented. He smoothed the wrinkles with his palm and tucked it in. Scout watched from the bathroom doorway, tail wagging. "Yeah, buddy," Dan said quietly. "We're going to fix this." The drive to Rachel's apartment felt longer than usual. Scout rode shotgun, nose pressed to the window, tail sweeping back and forth across the seat. Dan gripped the steering wheel tight. His heart hammered in his chest. What if she wouldn't listen? What if the damage was too deep? He pushed the thoughts away. Lila's drawing sat folded in his pocket, a reminder of why he couldn't give up. He parked outside the small apartment building and took a breath. "All right, let's go." Scout jumped down from the truck, tail still wagging. The dog seemed more hopeful than Dan felt. Dan climbed the stairs to the second floor. His footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway. He stopped outside Rachel's door. Number 2B. The paint was chipped. The doormat read, "Welcome." He knocked. Silence. He waited, stomach tight. Finally, footsteps approached. The peephole darkened. A long pause. Then The door cracked open. Just a few inches. The chain lock still fastened. Rachel's face appeared in the gap. Her eyes were red-rimmed, tired, guarded. "Dan," she said flatly. "Rachel." His voice came out hoarse. "Can we talk? Please?" She hesitated. Her gaze dropped to Scout, who sat perfectly still at Dan's feet. "I don't know what there is to say. I brought something. Evidence." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "This is my police report. From the day at the park. Look at it. Please." Rachel's eyes narrowed, but she reached through the gap and took the paper. Dan waited while she read, watched her expression shift. You never mentioned my name," she whispered. "No, I never did. The reporter got your information somewhere else, probably from court records. I tried to protect you both." His voice cracked. "I'm so sorry it got twisted. I never meant for any of this to hurt you." Rachel's hand trembled against the doorframe. "The hearing is next week," she said quietly. "They're reviewing my custody. They think I'm careless, unfit." Dan's chest tightened. "You're not. You're the strongest person I know." She looked up, tears brimming. "I can't lose her, Dan. She's everything." "You won't." The words came out fierce, certain. "I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what happened. How you did everything right. How Lila's bravery came from you." Rachel's breath hitched. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the truth." Dan paused. "And because you and Lila, you've meant more to me than you know." The silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Rachel closed the door. Dan's heart sank. He heard the chain slide free. The door opened wide. Rachel stood there, tears streaming down her face. "Come in." The apartment felt familiar, warm, lived in. Lila sat at the small kitchen table, coloring. She looked up when Dan entered, and her face lit up like sunshine. "Mr. Dan!" She started to jump up, but Rachel put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Homework first, sweetie. You can say hi in a minute." Lila nodded and bent back over her coloring book, but she kept sneaking glances at Dan and Scout. Rachel led Dan to the couch. They sat, leaving space between them. "I was scared," Rachel said quietly. "Scared that everyone was right, that I failed her." "You didn't fail anyone. I left her alone for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to run into the store, and—" Her voice broke. "And a predator saw an opportunity," Dan said firmly. "That's not your fault. You couldn't have known." Rachel wiped her eyes. "The caseworker said my negligence put Lila at risk." Dan's jaw tightened. "That's garbage. You're a good mother, the best." She looked at him, searching his face. "You really mean that?" "Every word." The evening settled into something quieter, gentler. Dan noticed the kitchen faucet dripping. "You want me to fix that?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I've been meaning to call a plumber, but I've got it." He spent the next hour under the sink with Scout lying nearby. Rachel made dinner while Lila did homework. The sounds of normal life, pots clanging, pages turning, Scout's soft snores, filled the apartment. It felt natural, right, like coming home. By the time Dan finished, Rachel had tucked Lila into bed. She emerged from the bedroom and smiled tiredly. "Thank you." "For everything." Dan stood, wiping his hands on a towel. "I should go. Let you rest." He called Scout and headed for the door. Then he heard quick footsteps. Lila burst out of her room in pajamas, hair messy, eyes bright. She ran straight to Dan and wrapped her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. Dan froze. Then his hand came down gently on her head. "See you at court, hero," Lila whispered against his shirt. Dan's throat closed. He blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. He looked down at her small, trusting face, smiled through the emotion. "Count on it, kiddo." Scout's tail thumped against the floor. Over the following days, Dan worked like a man on a mission. He sat at his kitchen table with papers spread across the surface, police reports, character references. timelines, every detail mattered. Scout lay beneath the table, chin resting on Dan's boot. A quiet presence. Dan had called his old commander, who'd written a letter about Dan's character and judgment. He'd contacted the officer who'd arrested the kidnapper, requesting documentation of the rescue. He'd even tracked down neighbors who could speak to Rachel's dedication as a mother. Each piece of evidence felt like armor, protection for Rachel and Lila. The family attorney, Miss Chen, had agreed to meet him twice. She was sharp and professional, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your testimony will carry weight," she'd said during their first meeting. "You're credible, decorated, and you have no personal stake in the outcome." "I have every stake in the outcome," Dan had replied quietly. She'd studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Let's make sure we get this right." They rehearsed his testimony over and over. What he saw at the park, how Lila signaled, why Rachel wasn't negligent, just human. Scout watched from his spot on the floor, tail thumping occasionally as if to encourage him. Rachel started visiting during those days, not for long, just brief stops to check in. She'd knock softly, carrying coffee or pastries she'd picked up on the way. "Thought you could use some fuel," she'd say, with a nervous smile. They'd sit at the table, sipping coffee and talking about anything except the hearing, the weather, Scout's newest trick, how Lila was doing in school. But the tension hummed beneath every word, the unspoken fear. One afternoon, Rachel laughed suddenly, a bright, startled sound. "What?" Dan asked. "This, all of this." She gestured around. "A month ago, I didn't even know you. Now you're preparing to testify at my custody hearing. Life is so strange." Dan smiled. "Strange doesn't mean bad." "No," she agreed softly. "It doesn't." Lila came with Rachel sometimes. She'd burst through the door with Scout greeting her like she was the best thing he'd ever seen. "Can I train him?" she asked one afternoon, eyes hopeful. "Sure," Dan said. "What kind of training?" "Secret missions." Dan bit back a smile. "All right. Show me what you've got." Lila spent an hour teaching Scout to infiltrate enemy territory, which mostly meant crawling under the porch and retrieving sticks. Scout played along with patient enthusiasm, tail wagging non-stop. Rachel watched from the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees. "She hasn't been this happy in weeks," she said quietly. Dan sat beside her. "Good. She deserves to be happy." Rachel's eyes glistened. "Thank you for all of this. You don't need to keep thanking me." "I do, though." She looked at him. "Because you didn't have to do any of this, but you did anyway." Dan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. The night before the hearing, Rachel brought Lila over for dinner. "I wanted to cook for you," she'd said, "to say thank you. One more time." Dan's kitchen filled with warmth and noise. Rachel moved around like she belonged there, boiling pasta and chopping vegetables. Lila set the table with exaggerated care, making sure every fork was perfectly straight. Scout followed Lila everywhere, nudging her hand for pets. They ate together at the small table. Lila chattered about school and her art project. Rachel smiled more than Dan had seen in days. He felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Contentment. After dinner, Lila curled up on the couch beside Scout. Within minutes, she was asleep, one small hand resting on the dog's fur. Rachel covered her with a blanket. "I should get her home. Let her rest a little longer," Dan said. "She's comfortable." Rachel sat in the chair across from him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly. "A little," Dan admitted. "But I've been through worse. I'm terrified." "I know." He leaned forward. "But tomorrow will be all right. I promise." Rachel's eyes searched his face. "You can't promise that." "I can try." She smiled weakly. "That's enough." Later, after Rachel and Lila had gone home, Dan sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was silent except for Scout's soft breathing from his bed in the corner. Dan pulled out the notes Ms. Chen had given him. Went over the key points one more time. Lila signaled for help. Rachel had done nothing wrong. The kidnapper was a professional predator. The words blurred together after a while. He rubbed his eyes and checked the clock. Past midnight. His gaze drifted to his jacket, hanging on the back of the chair. Slowly, he reached into the pocket and pulled out Lila's drawing, the one she'd left in his mailbox. A soldier under a tree. A little girl tapping her shoe. "You saved me once. Don't stop now." Dan stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. A talisman. A reminder. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that courtroom and tell the truth. For Rachel. For Lila. For himself. He stood and turned off the kitchen light. Scout lifted his head. "Come on, buddy," Dan whispered. "Let's get some sleep." The dog followed him down the hall. The house settled into darkness, and the clock ticked softly toward morning. Early morning rain drizzled across the courthouse steps. Gray clouds hung low, and the air smelled like wet pavement. Dan held his jacket over Rachel's head as they climbed the stairs. Lila clutched her mother's hand, eyes wide as she took in the tall stone building. Reporters huddled near the entrance under umbrellas. Cameras flashed. "Ms. Moore, do you have a statement?" "Mr. Cole, what made you decide to testify?" Dan positioned himself between them and the cameras, blocking their view. "No comment," he said firmly. Rachel kept her head down, guiding Lila through the doors. Inside, the courthouse echoed with footsteps and hushed voices. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of old wood and floor polish filled the air. Scout walked beside Dan, his service vest marking him as allowed inside. Lila glanced back at the dog, her small face tight with worry. Dan knelt down. "Hey, kiddo, it's going to be okay." She nodded, but her lip trembled. Rachel squeezed her daughter's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go." The hearing room was smaller than Dan expected. Wood-paneled walls, a long table, rows of chairs. Judge Hensley sat at the bench, gray-haired and dignified, reviewing papers through reading glasses. Ms. Chen, the family attorney, greeted them with a reassuring nod. "Ready?" "As we'll ever be," Rachel whispered. They took their seats. Lila sat between Rachel and Dan, her hands folded in her lap. Scout settled at Dan's feet. The social worker, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, sat across from them. She shuffled through a file. Judge Hensley looked up. "Let's begin." The social worker spoke first. Her voice was professional but firm. She referenced the incident at the park, the kidnapping, the article that painted Rachel as negligent. "Ms. Moore left her daughter unsupervised in a public space," the social worker said. "This allowed a dangerous individual to approach the child without intervention." Rachel's hands tightened in her lap. "Ms." Chen countered, presenting police reports and witness statements. She emphasized that Rachel had been within sight, that the kidnapper was a skilled predator, that no parent could have predicted what happened. But the social worker pressed on. "The perception matters. This case raised concerns about Ms. Moore's judgment." Dan's jaw clenched. He wanted to stand up right then and shout the truth. But he waited. His turn would come. Judge Hensley called him to the stand. Dan rose, straightened his jacket, and walked forward. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then he sat in the witness chair, facing the room. The judge studied him. "Mr. Cole, you were present the day of the incident. Please tell us what you observed." Dan took a breath. His voice came out steady and clear. "I go to Brookdale Park most afternoons with my dog. That day, I was sitting on my usual bench when I noticed a little girl across the park. She was sitting beside a man I didn't recognize." He paused, glancing at Lila. She watched him with wide eyes. "At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I saw her hands. She was tapping her shoe. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short." The judge leaned forward slightly. "What did that mean to you?" "Morse code. SOS. It's a distress signal." I learned it in the army. Murmurs rippled through the room. Dan continued. When I looked at her, she looked right back at me. She wasn't playing. She was asking for help. He described following them, calling the police, intervening at the gas station. Then Ms. Chen asked, Mr. Cole, did you observe anything about Ms. Moore's behavior that day that suggested negligence? No, Dan said firmly. Rachel was watching Lila. She was close by. The kidnapper was a professional. He waited for the exact moment when she turned her back for just a few seconds. That's how predators work. They exploit the smallest opening. The social worker spoke up. But if Ms. Moore had been more vigilant, no parent can watch their child every single second. Dan interrupted, his voice stronger now. Rachel loves her daughter. She's a good mother. She works 2 jobs to keep a roof over Lila's head. She cooks her meals. She helps with homework. She sacrifices everything for that little girl. He looked directly at Rachel. Her eyes glistened with tears. Lila's courage that day didn't come from nowhere. Dan said quietly, it came from her mother. Rachel taught her to be brave, to be smart, to ask for help when she needed it. That's what saved Lila's life. The room fell silent. Dan's voice softened. That little girl's signal didn't just save her life. It saved mine, too. Tears streaked down Rachel's face. Lila gripped her mother's hand. Even the social worker looked away, blinking hard. Judge Hensley removed his glasses and set them on the bench. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. Ms. Moore, I've reviewed the evidence. I've heard the testimony. And I've seen enough. Rachel held her breath. This case is closed. You retain full custody of your daughter. No further review is necessary. Rachel sobbed, pulling Leila into her arms. Ms. Chen smiled, tears in her own eyes. Dan exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. Scout's tail thumped against the floor. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the wet pavement. Rachel stepped out of the courthouse and immediately turned to Dan. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Dan hugged her back, his throat tight. "You did this. Not me." Lila wrapped her arms around Scout's neck, pressing her face into his fur. The dog stood patiently, tail wagging. The sunlight grew brighter, warming the cool air. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt right. 1 month later, Brookdale Park looked nothing like the quiet place Dan visited every afternoon. Colorful booths lined the walking paths. Red, white, and blue banners hung from tree branches. The smell of hot dogs and popcorn drifted through the warm air. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children chased each other between the booths, their laughter ringing out like bells. A banner stretched across the main pavilion, Community Heroes Day, celebrating courage in Brookdale. Dan walked through the park gates with Rachel and Lila. Scout trotted beside them, wearing a bright red bandana around his neck. "Look at all the people." Lila bounced on her toes, eyes wide. Rachel smiled, adjusting the strap of her purse. "It's a big day." Dan glanced around. The crowd felt overwhelming, but Scout pressed against his leg, grounding him. He took a breath. "You okay?" Rachel asked quietly. He nodded. "Yeah, just not used to this much attention." She touched his arm gently. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." "I know." He met her eyes. "But I want to be here." Lila tugged on his sleeve. "Can Scout and I go say hi to the other kids?" Dan smiled. "Go ahead. Stay where we can see you." "Okay." She grabbed Scout's leash and ran toward a group of children gathered near a face-painting booth. Rachel watched her go, warmth filling her chest. "She's doing so much better." "She is," Dan agreed. They walked slowly toward the pavilion, staying close enough to keep an eye on Lila. Rachel stopped at a lemonade stand and ordered 2 cups. She handed one to Dan. "Thank you." He took a sip. the cold sweetness cutting through the summer heat. They found a shaded spot beneath the old oak tree, Dan's usual bench. He sat down, and Rachel settled beside him. For a moment, they just watched the park come alive around them. "I started at the clinic this week," Rachel said. "How's it going?" "Good. Really good, actually." She smiled. "It's part-time for now, but they said if things go well, they'll bring me on full-time by fall." "That's great, Rachel. It feels like I'm finally getting my life back on track." She glanced at him. "Thanks to you." Dan shook his head. "You did that yourself." "No." Her voice was firm but kind. "You helped us when no one else would. You stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself." He didn't know what to say to that. Rachel's expression softened. "Life feels new again. Like we're not just surviving anymore. We're actually living." Dan looked down at his lemonade. "I know what you mean." She studied him for a moment. "You're different, too. Lighter, somehow." He thought about that. The weight he'd carried for so long. The grief, the loneliness, the guilt. It was still there. But it didn't press down on him the way it used to. "I guess I am," he said quietly. Across the lawn, Lila was kneeling beside Scout, showing him off to a group of kids. "This is Scout," she announced proudly. "He's my rescue dog." A boy around her age leaned closer. "He saved you?" "Yep. Him and Mr. Dan. Scout knew I was scared. He helped find me." The children looked at Scout with awe. The golden retriever sat patiently, tail wagging as little hands petted his soft fur. Leela beamed. "He's the best dog in the whole world." Scout barked once, as if agreeing. A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could gather near the pavilion, we're about to begin our awards ceremony." Rachel stood, brushing off her skirt. "That's us?" Dan's stomach tightened. "Right!" They walked toward the pavilion together. Lila ran over, Scout trotting beside her. Mayor Ellis, an older man with silver hair and a kind smile, stood at the microphone. He welcomed the crowd and spoke about the importance of community and courage. Then he said, "Today, we're here to honor someone who exemplifies those values. A man who saw danger and didn't look away. A man who saved a child's life." Dan's chest tightened. "Please join me in welcoming Daniel Cole to the stage." The crowd erupted in applause. Rachel squeezed his hand. "Go on." Dan walked forward, Scout at his side. His legs felt heavy, but he kept moving. Mayor Ellis shook his hand warmly and held up a wooden plaque. "For your courage and quick thinking, we honor you today." The applause grew louder. Dan stood at the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, all those faces, all that noise. Then he saw Rachel and Lila standing near the front, smiling. He cleared his throat. "Thank you. But this isn't just my story." He turned toward them. "Rachel, Lila, would you come up here?" Rachel's eyes widened. Lila grabbed her hand, and they walked onto the stage together. Dan looked at the crowd. "This is our story. All three of us. Because courage isn't just one person. It's everyone who refuses to give up. It's a little girl who asked for help when she needed it. It's a mother who fought for her daughter. It's all of us choosing to do the right thing, even when it's hard." The crowd applauded again, warmer this time. Rachel's eyes glistened with tears. After the ceremony, they returned to the oak tree. Lila sat on the grass, legs crossed, and reached into her pocket. "I made something for you," she said, holding out a small wooden whistle. Dan took it carefully. It was simple, but beautifully carved, smooth and light in his palm. "I carved it myself," Lila said proudly. "Miss Rachel helped a little." Dan smiled. "It's perfect. Next time I need help, I'll blow this instead of tapping," she said. "So you'll hear me better." Dan knelt down to meet her eyes. His voice was steady and full of warmth. "And I'll come running," he promised. Scout barked once, tail wagging. Lila giggled and threw her arms around Dan's neck. The crowd began to thin as evening settled over Brookdale Park. Families packed up their blankets. Vendors closed their booths. The music from the pavilion faded into silence. Dan, Rachel, and Lila walked slowly toward the old oak tree. The same spot where Dan used to sit alone every afternoon. The same place where he first saw Lila's signal. Scout padded beside them, his red bandana bright against his golden fur. "Can we sit for a while?" Lila asked. "Of course," Rachel said. They settled beneath the tree. Dan leaned against the rough bark. Rachel sat beside him, and Lila sprawled on the grass with Scout. The sky turned soft shades of orange and pink. The air smelled like summer grass and distant rain. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a brass plaque no bigger than her hand. Dan leaned forward. "What's that?" "Something I wanted to do," Rachel said quietly. "For all of us." She knelt at the base of the tree and placed the plaque against the trunk. The engraving caught the fading light. "In honor of the day, a little girl sent a signal, and a soldier followed." Dan stared at the words. His throat tightened. Lila crawled over to look. She traced the letters with her finger. "It's beautiful, Mama." Rachel's voice was soft. "I wanted people to remember. Not just what happened, but what it means. That paying attention matters. That courage can be quiet." Dan didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded. Rachel sat back beside him. "A month ago, I thought I was going to lose everything. My daughter, my home, my hope." She looked at him. "But I didn't, because someone saw. Someone cared enough to follow." Dan shook his head. "You would have made it through. You're stronger than you think." "Maybe," Rachel said, "but I didn't have to do it alone. That's what makes the difference." Lila hugged Scout, burying her face in his fur. "I was so scared that day." Rachel's hand found her daughter's shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. But I remembered what you told me," Lila said, "that if I'm ever scared, I should ask for help. So I did." "You were so brave," Dan said. Lila looked at him. "You came. You didn't have to? But you did." "Of course I did." "Why?" Dan thought about that. He glanced at the plaque, then at Rachel, then at the little girl who had changed everything. "Because some things matter more than being safe," he said. "Some things are worth the risk." The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched long across the grass. Lila stood and tugged Scout's leash. "Come on, boy, let's play." She ran across the lawn, and Scout bounded after her, barking happily. Rachel watched them go, a smile softening her face. "She's finally sleeping through the night again. That's good. She's talking about school starting in the fall. Making friends. Normal things." Rachel's voice grew quiet. "I wasn't sure we'd ever get back to normal." "Normal's overrated anyway," Dan said. Rachel laughed softly. "Maybe you're right." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when people have walked through fire together. "What about you?" Rachel asked. "How are you doing?" Dan watched Lila throw a stick for Scout. The dog raced after it, tail wagging furiously. "Better," he said honestly. "A lot better. You seem lighter." "I feel lighter." He paused. "For a long time, I didn't think I deserved to be happy again. Like if I moved on, I'd be forgetting." Rachel waited. "But I think I understand now," Dan continued. "Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It just means choosing to live again." Rachel's eyes glistened. "Yeah, it does." She leaned her head against his shoulder. Dan didn't move. He just sat there, feeling the warmth of her beside him, the gentle weight of her trust. Across the lawn, Lila laughed as Scout licked her face. Twilight deepened. The sky turned indigo. Stars began to prick through the gathering dark. Fireflies emerged from the grass, their soft lights blinking like tiny miracles. Lila gasped. "Look! Fireflies!" She and Scout chased them in slow circles, her giggles rising into the warm air. Dan glanced down at the brass plaque, gleaming faintly in the fading light. He thought about all the afternoons he'd sat here alone, lost in grief, convinced his purpose had ended. He'd been wrong. Rachel lifted her head from his shoulder. "Thank you, Dan, for everything. You don't have to keep thanking me." "I know, but I want to." He smiled. "Then you're welcome." She stood and brushed off her skirt. "Come on, let's go catch fireflies with Lila." Dan rose to his feet. Scout trotted over, tail wagging, and pressed against his leg. Dan knelt and scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good boy." Scout's tail thumped against the ground. Dan straightened and looked at Rachel, then at Lila dancing through the fireflies. He whispered, almost to himself, "Guess we all got rescued in the end." Rachel heard. She smiled and took his hand. Together, they walked toward Lila. Scout followed, his steps steady and sure. The park settled into peaceful stillness. The plaque gleamed softly beneath the old oak tree. Fireflies flickered through the branches like tiny stars come down to earth. And in that quiet, perfect moment, everything felt whole again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you do not miss out on tomorrow's story. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy.